Good evening and welcome to Garden Hour. We are here to share information about all things yards and gardens and to answer questions you may have about yards and gardens and the plants and the creepy crawlers in them. Our panelists tonight are Kristine Lang, SDSU Extension Consumer Horticulture Specialist. And what are you going to be sharing with us tonight, Kristine?
I'm going to be talking about some things that you should be considering before you go out to buy your perennials and annuals, and right plant, right place is going to be the theme tonight.
Sounds great. And our other panelist tonight is Amanda Bachmann, SDSU Extension Pesticide Education and Urban Entomology Field Specialist. And Amanda, do you have some special creepy crawlers to talk about tonight?
Yeah, so I've got to follow up on some of our tick discussion from last week. I did my homework on the tick ranges for everybody, and then also going through some of the critters that I've been seeing around Pier over the past week, and kind of what to, how you can keep an eye out for things that are migrating into the state, like the monarchs. So we'll touch on when we might see monarchs next.
We get to see icky things and beautiful things, right? And I will follow up. I'm Rhoda Burrows, SDSU Extension Horticulture Specialist, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how to know when to plant what. I see a lot of questions about that on social media, and then a bit about strawberries. If you do have questions throughout the evening, we encourage you to use the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. At least if you're using a computer, a tablet, or a phone, might be in another spot, but it says Q&A to enter your question. You can use that at any time throughout the evening, and we'll keep an eye on it. So I'm going to turn it on over to Kristine.
All right. Well, I know last week I belabored the point on patience and waiting to plant and at least seeing yourselves through to the weekend. I was at a Master Gardener public event on Saturday, and we spent the morning talking about gardening, and I just couldn't contain myself, and I couldn't just talk about gardening anymore. So I had a lot of transplants that had been sitting out and hardening on our patio. So if you look, I should have circled it, but if you look in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see we had totes of those seedlings that I showed photos of last week that sat out for several days in the shade, hardening off on this patio. It caught a lot of wind, so they definitely strengthened those stems. And I ended up pulling out all of my pots and assessing all of my raised beds. And I'll have another picture of some soil considerations towards the end of this. But I did end up putting some plants in the soil this weekend, and they caught some of those rains, and we've been monitoring watering really closely. And the photo on the right, I'm pointing out some of the plants I put out, and I think it's a tale of maybe three responses, so to speak. So the plant in the yellow circle, those are pansies. They're a cool season annual. They're really robust little plants. A great way to get those early season blooms. And they looked great as they were hardening off as transplants. And this was after they had just been watered, but they honestly looked really nice the next day. So they transplanted well, didn't mind the cool evening temperatures and some of the winds that came with the storms. Again, do as I say, not as I do. I do all of these things to take pictures and show you what happens. Interestingly enough, the plant in the purple circle, those are snapdragons. They also are pretty tolerant of cool temperatures, but they did show some signs of transplant shock, and the stems got a little beat up in the wind, and I think temperatures just were not quite where they wanted to be. And then again, do as I say, not as I do. I toyed around with transplanting nasturtium, which is the lovely little circular leaf. Ignore the beautiful butterfly in the photo, but the lovely little circular leaf in the orange circle, that's nasturtium. And a fun thing about nasturtium is the leaves as well as the flowers are edible and have a peppery flavor. So I'm really excited about using those this summer. They typically don't transplant well. And in the name of research, I did some transplants and put them out in the garden. And then I also direct sowed some additional nasturtium in this bed just to see, do some side by side comparisons in terms of plant performance. So stay tuned for an update on that. Something else I want to note about this bed is I have a mix of both cool and warm season plants in here. So the snapdragons and the pansies, I expect them to kind of fade into the background as the warm season progresses. And my hope is that, and my goal, so I have interseeded nasturtium in here, is that the nasturtium will take over, especially as our temperatures rise July into August. And the nasturtium is really going to be blooming and performing. And the pansies, they're going to pretty much fade out, and I won't be surprised if they die out if things get as hot as they did last summer. And the snapdragons, once we get some blooms, I'll get those pruned back and just kind of let those set in that garden space until we get cooler temperatures in the fall where we might get some blooms again. So again, some of those cool season annuals, osteospermum, are notorious for this. You'll have beautiful blooms when you pick them out in the garden center. And in those hot months, you're not going to have bloom production, but you should see some performance return again later in the fall with cool temperatures. So with that take-home message, those are just some of the things I've been up to in my own situation. The other thing I'm going to point out is it's always important to think back to how did things go last year and what should I do differently this year? So that goes with the theme of planning. And I had way too many small pots. I had, big pots and medium pots and my raised beds, as you can see in this photo. And all of these small pots, they are not getting planted this year. It was too hard to keep up with watering, especially in a hot, dry, windy summer up on a second-story balcony. And, having enough critical mass of soil to support your plants and hold enough water to get through the weekend without everything being panic mode is really, really important. This is a southern exposure balcony, so a lot of the things I plant are full sun with the exception of plants that are tucked kind of back in the corner. So one thing to consider, how did things go last year and what can you change for this year? And this really just is a through point for the theme of, thinking about some things before you go out and buy. Our garden centers are open. They're excited to see you. It's finally time to buy those plants, and it's going to be safe to take them home and start planting some of these beautiful flowers. I had the chance to go to my alma mater up in Crookston, Minnesota a few weeks ago, and this was their greenhouse, and their students had grown and produced all these plants, and it was just absolutely lovely. I wanted to take every single hanging basket home with me. So to avoid that temptation of taking home way more plants than you need, although of course garden centers, we would love for you to do that, right? But have a list, maybe map out some garden sketches. My dad was always really big on, mapping out just kind of some rough sketches on grid paper of the gardens and trying to think about how many annuals were needed and what did we do last year? Okay, that got too crowded. So just kind of maybe go in with a plan, especially if you're looking for a lot of plant material, having a checklist can be really, really helpful. So what else should you be looking for? If you're working on a perennial garden or looking to add some new herbaceous perennials to your yard, it's really important to know your hardiness zone. So this is the latest map from the USDA. And remember, this map is generated, it's the average annual extreme minimum temperature. So what is the absolute coldest it's gotten based on historical data for your area? And looking at this map, most of South Dakota is sitting in the 4B climate zone. A lot of you up north, you're in 4A. There are a few pockets out in the hills that are 3B. And of course, your growing seasons tend to be shorter overall, but sometimes your winter situation can be a little bit more temperate than our northern neighbors. So when you're looking at plant material and you want perennials that are going to overwinter and come back and be successful year over year in the garden, make sure you check that plant tag and look at that hardiness zone. with most of our local garden centers that are worth their weight in salt, and all of them are, they should only be stocking plant material that's hardy for this zone, but it doesn't hurt to cross-check. But this becomes especially important if you'd be ordering plant material from out of state, or ordering perennial flower seeds from a catalog or things like that. Make sure you check that hardiness zone. Some people can push the limits on this. If you've got a microclimate or an area that's more sheltered, or maybe it collects more snowfall, or, is closer to the house, so it's not going to freeze as hard on those 50 below winter days, that can be really helpful. We had a discussion this weekend about lupines. They're a beautiful flower, beautiful stalks of kind of bell-shaped blooms. Texas is known for them. In their early, their definition of spring is going to be months before ours. A lot of lupines are only hardy until through zone 5. There are a couple of series such as the Russell and Tutti Frutti series that are hardy to zone 4. So there are some opportunities for success with lupines. And I just use that as an example that it's maybe an exception more than a rule that it's always going to do well here. So if you're someone who likes to experiment with plants and push the bounds, by all means do so, but just recognize there might be some frustrations or some financial risks to that. But I'm all in favor of trying new things, but I also want you to be successful. All right. So I mentioned that my balcony's southern exposure and it gets full sun. Well, what on earth does that mean? So in plant terms, we feel really confident about the definition of full sun. That's 6 to 8 hours or more a day. So full sun, to be full sun, really 6 hours minimum. For a lot of our vegetable crops, only 6 hours of full direct sunlight is probably not going to cut it. So really strive for that 8+ hours if you can. In terms of locations around buildings and homes, that tends to be your southern and your western exposures, or those full open spaces in the middle of your yard or the middle of your backyard. So as you're thinking about your yard, paying attention to shadows and what does it look like at noon? What does it look like at 3 o'clock in the afternoon? Is it completely shaded by 2 based on how the sun's moving over your house? That's something to consider. So part sun and part shade, there's kind of some ambiguous ranges associated with that. Some sources call this, anywhere between 3 to 5 hours. So if it's a spot that's sunny for about half the day, you're going to want to focus on some of those partial sun plants that are labeled for tolerating reduced light levels. And one of the things you'll notice with plants is, well, how do I know if it's not getting enough light? If you've seen this plant in someone else's garden in a different spot or multiple locations, and you have it in your spot, and it's not blooming really well, or the foliage growth is really reduced, that might be a plant that needs more light, or it might need less light. If you're seeing a lot of like leaf scorching or browning on the edges, or just a generally unhappy plant, double check, was that supposed to be full sun? Or with a lot of that browning and scorching, it maybe is getting too much sun and needs to be in a more shaded condition. So for full shade plants, a lot of our begonias and patiens, hostas are great options. There's some really fun shade plants, and I think I'm going to save that list. Maybe we'll walk through some fun shade options for our next garden hour. But thinking about the north edge of the house, or under awnings, or if you have, any sorts of awnings or large eaves. My grandmother's house, the eaves stick out about 3 feet, which really protects the windows, but also makes it hard to have nice gardens right next to the house, for example. And, under trees, you'll see this with our spring ephemerals. They come up early in the spring, they can get that sunlight, but then later in the season, it's really shaded out, and you start to see more just like your jack-in-the-pulpits or your snow in the mountain, things that are really tolerant of that shady understory. So those are some things to consider when you're looking at, and this applies to annuals and perennials. So kind of pay attention to those plant tags and recognize what your conditions are for your site. All right, and this is in the theme of planning ahead, is with those annual plantings, whether it's containers or raised beds or your garden plantings, How big is that plant material expected to get? Most of those plant tags or the catalogs will specify some general size ranges. And that helps you plan out how much plant material to purchase, how you should be spacing it out. And some of this is based on how full you want it to get, but recognize if you want, here in the middle, I had a lovely basil plant that I ended up letting it bloom. But I thought, oh, wouldn't it be fun to have the bright green basil and the purple basil and mix it with the sweet potato vines and have all these purples and greens. And it looked really lovely. But as that sweet potato vine started to trail and take over the planting, I didn't have as many basil leaves as I wanted for my pesto. And that was okay because I was mostly going for an ornamental look here with a little bit of edible flair as well. But just remember, sometimes it's hard, and I have this problem. I want to fill my garden beds. Right now I would love to have them be full and beautiful and gorgeous, but that can lend itself to overplanting, which can lead to, lots of competition for water as well as light later in the season, and mean that your garden's looking pretty tough. So I would say pay attention to those planting and spacing requirements. That really is going to help you balance having nice, full, gorgeous containers that are sustainable and not outcompeting themselves later in the season. And thinking about perennial gardens, same rule applies. I love this photo. This is from McCrory Gardens, showing kind of some peak bloom performance. I want to say this was July. We've got some ornamental oregano in the front, the bright purple flowers, that's a garden phlox. The light purple, that's a salvia. Or not a salvia, oh my goodness, Paravoschia growing in the background. And we have some yarrows over here. So with your perennial plantings, trying to get different bloom times is really fun. And it also supports pollinators and wildlife throughout the season, and you'll have color season round. But also thinking about, I wouldn't have put the garden phlox right up here in the front. And in fact, this is creeping phlox, which acted as a nice low carpet and had an early spring bloom and then kind of fades into the background as other things grow up and around it. So you'll see that there's some daylilies poking through here in the back. Again, that would be something that was used for height, or if you had large hibiscus that you were putting into the garden. So I think being aware of heights, especially if you're only going to be looking at the planting from one side, so that you have some tall, some middle ground, and then some foreground in your planting, can be really helpful. And again, with perennial plantings, it might take 2 to 3 to 4 years for that to really fill up. But if you don't want to be, dividing perennials every year and moving things around, and most perennials wouldn't appreciate being divided every year, it's important to plan ahead, give them space, use a lot of mulch around those plantings to keep down the weeds and give them room to spread out and grow. And be patient. So tying it back to last week, a little bit of patience. All right. I do get asked fairly often, what kind of plants do well in a container if I'm doing raised beds, or if I'm doing, patio pots or hanging baskets. And one of my new favorite places to look for container ideas is the All American Selections website. And that website's at the bottom of this page, and we'll share that link with you as well. All American Selections is a nonprofit organization. They have trial sites at universities and public gardens across the United States. And these are blind trials. I actually serve as an evaluator for some of the in-ground trials. And so when we're looking at those plants, we don't know who the breeder was, who the company was. We're judging this plant in comparison to others and ranking how well it performs, whether it's in the ground in the garden, or if it's a container trial, how well it's doing in that container. Does it fit within it? Is it completely spilling over and there's no way you can keep up with watering? Can I get good peppers and tomatoes off of this container planting, for example? So if you're looking for some good container ideas, I highly recommend looking at the container suitable filter category on the All American Selections page. And you can also filter this by region, and I believe they call us the Heartland region. So you can filter that by geographic region and get some plants that are going to be great for South Dakota, might not be great for Florida, but they'll work for us. All right, and as you're getting ready to put those plants out, I kind of touched on this already. Do take care to prepare those transplants for being outdoors, whether it's your own home or the garden center that they're growing in currently. Those are optimum conditions. They're protected from wind, they've got light, but there might be a little bit of shading. So things have been pretty good compared to our outdoor conditions where, especially if you're putting this in a full sun situation, that's going to be full direct sun exposure. There's likely going to be more wind, and we need those plants to have time to root into the soil. So a great way to prevent transplant shock is to harden transplants. Doing this for a week or more is ideal. If you can even do this for a couple of days versus just taking them from the garden center and putting them straight into the garden. So again, planning ahead, but having those plants set out, especially if you're moving from your home or from that greenhouse, putting those plants first in a shaded a shaded site outdoors, gradually acclimating them to light over several days can be really helpful. This is also a great time to start cutting back on watering and fertility, just to allow those plants to strengthen their stems and put more of those reserves into rooting into the ground. Once you plant them, you're going to want to resume using a fertilizer solution and a steady watering regimen. But this allows those plants to avoid as much transplant shock. And finally, preparing your garden soil, I wanted to just point out my approach to raised beds. These basically sat all winter. I had removed the foliage from the top of the beds. A lot of it just died back. Some of that I removed just so it wasn't blowing around. And with these beds, I ended up pulling out large root balls that were going to get in the way. I did not, completely dump out this soil, and this soil mix included, from last year, I included compost, sand, a little bit of mineral soil, as well as peat, and a pretty heavy addition of compost at that. So when I removed those root balls, that left enough space that I would say I added about 2 inches of compost across the top of this entire bed, and I incorporated that into the soil. That adds more organic matter and provides a fresh charge of nutrients. The other thing I did with all of my raised beds this year is I'm using a slow release granular fertilizer. There are several of those products on the market. They typically look like pebbles. They might be, yellow or green or, kind of coated in a clay product. And the idea with some of those slow release fertilizers is they slowly dissolve over multiple waterings, and they're recommended that they last 3 to 4 months. And there's a recommendation for, based on square footage or cubic footage of soil, how much you should incorporate. And generally you put that in the top 1 to 3 inches of your soil. So that's how I'm going to be managing my fertility this year to ensure that foliage and blooms are successful year round or throughout the season. And then proper watering after planting. Some of you have heard me talk about this before, but I am a big fan of water breakers, not water blasters. A water blaster is what you use to wash your car. If it's spraying a stream of water that you can use to wash your car or wash your concrete driveway, it is too aggressive for plants. So look for those watering wands that, have the rain setting and really break that stream of water into, lots of droplets. Whether it's annual or perennial plantings, you really want to soak that soil after a new planting. That helps settle the soil around the roots, closes up those air pockets. And, in these first few weeks after planting out those annual and perennial plantings, we talk about 1 inch of water per week, but if we're not getting rainfall, and remember those annual plants have tiny, tiny little root balls that aren't reaching into the rest of the soil for water, you'll want to probably check that water every other day. Still a nice deep watering. We're not just going to sprinkle it for 2 seconds and then walk away. So dig down into that soil. The surface might look wet, but ensure that that water is actually penetrating the entire and saturating the entire root zone for that plant material. And with raised beds, especially if you're using soil that is completely dried out, as mine was, plan to water check if it's soaked through, plan to water again. Your raised beds, especially if they're elevated, you should have drain holes on there so you're not creating a flood or a pond. But make sure you're fully saturating that soil, and especially with those peat-based soil mixes, they tend to shrink up and a lot of that water will just run down the cracks, the gap on the edge of the planter box or the container. Make sure that you're allowing that media to expand and completely fill up with water, and it's not all just running out the sides and the middle is completely dry. And last but not least, I want to encourage everyone, if you're in the area or if you're up for a road trip this weekend, Amanda Bachmann, John Ball, and we would love to see you at the Garden Discovery Festival. We're going to be joined by master gardeners, a lot of our colleagues at SDSU Extension, and some of the other departments. We also have some great local nonprofits and government organizations that are excited to talk about gardening and urban ag. So we're going to have educational booths, we're going to have presentations, garden tours, there's going to be a plant sale, both master gardener plant sale and native plant sale. So we'd love to see you at Garden Discovery Festival, rain or shine event. And this is, McCrory Gardens is going to be offering free admission on Sunday as well. So bring the whole family. This is an event for gardeners of all ages and skill levels. So we'd love to see you. All right. I see that we have some questions rolling in. All right.
There's one about where can you get compost?
All right. Where can you get compost? Well, it depends on how much you need. In my current situation, I'm using small batches. So I have found bags of compost available at my local garden center, or a lot of, even the hardware stores might be supplying it. If you're looking for volume, there are some national compost groups that will ship it by the truckload if you're really looking for compost. There are definitely opportunities to use municipal compost sources, but make sure you ask them if they test for herbicide residues, because if you have a lot of grass clippings going into that compost, that could cause issues for your annual flowers as well as your vegetables. And of course, you might have someone who's composting manure on their farm. And Rhoda, do you want to weigh in on some considerations with that?
You want to always make sure that if you've got any compost that could have manure in it, that you age it at least a year to help break down any pathogens that might be in it. It'll also help break down some of the more potent organic matter that could burn your plants. Those are two of the things, especially if you're using it on edibles in the garden.
Yeah. So I see a question just came in, review the watering process for raised beds again. So again, my raised beds are up on legs. I do have drain holes that have been drilled into the bottom of each of those raised beds. I didn't do that many because I'm just using untreated pine wood for my raised beds. So it tends to shrink and swell and crack, and water does drain out of the cracks as well. But I did put some drain holes in there. I don't know that I would have reached a situation last summer where I would have overwatered it, but if we had a week of constant rains and that wood would swell up tight and there were no drain holes, I'd be a little bit concerned about waterlogging that plant material. So if you have a raised bed and you have an opportunity to put a few drain holes in it, I would advise doing so. Just don't make sure they're not too large so all of your soil is just washing out in the process. And you could always put a little bit of like window screen if you find your drain holes are too large and a lot of potting media is starting to rush out of that.
Several years ago, we had some compost that was put in raised beds here in Rapid City, and they placed the compost in the beds and transplanted the plants in and watered it thoroughly. I came the next day, there was water sitting on the top, and I took my finger and put it in, and it had gone down only that far. It was bone dry underneath and the plants were all wilting.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, some of those mixes can be really hydrophobic, so you might have to kind of pre-moisten them and mix them. Was there any particular reason you think that happened in that case?
I think it was probably very mostly compost rather than any soil mixed with it. And sometimes that organic matter does, it's like peat moss that's very dry. It just doesn't want to take up water.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, sometimes you need some of that mixing action can help it along in my experience, but things to pay attention to. What you see on the surface might not be how things are underneath it. All right, well, I see we have a couple of tree and woody plant questions. We might need to put a pin in those for Dr. Ball for next week when he returns. What do you think, Rhoda?
I think I'll talk about the fruit one later on, but
okay.
There is a question about composting manure. Does this need to be turned or can it be piled and left? You know, the FDA is actually trying to answer that question has for the past several years, because it does come into our food safety rules for producers. The official answer right now is that you need to turn it and go through a process where you make sure it's heated up. But according to organic standards, if it's left long enough, you can use it. So there's not a clear-cut answer to that. However, if you do turn it, it certainly will help it break down more quickly and help distribute it so you don't have hot spots in it or so forth. It is a good idea to cover it, especially if you've got fresh manure on it, to help it. Well, if you've got fresh manure in a pile on your gardens next door, when we have those 60-mile-an-hour winds, you can have some fresh manure on your garden real easily, or flies flying back and forth and so forth. So it's a good idea to cover it if it's upwind from your garden.
So Rhoda, I see a new question coming in. Can I use pine cones around plants as a form of mulch? Now, I've heard of using pine needles. What do you think on pine cones? I'd be a little nervous about getting them thick enough that weeds won't just go through.
I throw pine cones in my mulch, just has ornamental, but it's not just pine cones.
Yeah. Now, I suppose if there was a way to kind of crush them and break them up so that they could be, you know, kind of more locked together, that might be an opportunity. This is one I might have to do a little homework on to see if anyone's done it.
See if you get some baby pines coming up through it.
Yes, that could be an issue. But again, I'm all for creative organic mulches as long as we know it's free of herbicides and it's dried up before we start piling it together. For example, with your lawn clippings, make sure it's free of herbicides and make sure you're applying that in small layers or letting it dry up before just putting it as a green soppy mess, because that's going to lock together. It's going to go anaerobic. It's going to smell terrible and it's not going to help your plants. So
we have actually had a incident out in the hills here where the Forest Service had been out spraying some herbicide to get rid of some woody plants, and those were chopped up into a mulch, and from the woody plants still had herbicide on them. So that herbicide will stick around, particularly some of the clopyralids, aminopyralids, some of those that are meant to get rid of woody plants tend to have quite some longevity to them.
And there was a clarification that part of the question was, or curious about if there'd be any specific oils in the pine cone that would inhibit growth. You know, I'm not sure on that one. We're going to have some questions for Dr. Ball next week, I think.
Yes, and somebody noted that turning the manure will help with the weed seeds, so that's always a good idea too. And sandburrs are awfully We used to have them where I grew up, and my bicycle tires were always going flat from sanders.
All right, well, I think that's it for my portion of the Q&A, but I'll hang tight if folks have other questions I can jump in on.
So I guess we will turn over next to find out what's with those ticks.
All right, let me get my screen shared here. So yeah, last week, folks were asking about the ranges for some of the ticks that I was talking about. So I pulled up the maps from the CDC on the 3 species that I sort of spent the most time on last week. So the American dog tick, that's the one that's sort of most common in the state. It's widespread. You can see on the range map that can be found across the entire state of South Dakota. And, here in Pierre, I know if I'm, out on La Fram or Farm Island, the American dog tick is the one that I run into the most. It can vector some diseases, Rocky Mountain spotted fever and tularemia. So, it is definitely still a vector for things. The Lone Star tick over here on the upper right, this is the one that you can see from the range map. It is sort of starting to move farther north. So those of you down in the southeastern corner of South Dakota, this is one to keep an eye out for. It has a very distinctive white spot on the back of the sort of like thorax area. So it does look sort of very different from the American dog tick. But Lone Star tick is the one that vectors alpha-gal, and that is the thing that can make you allergic to eating red meat. So I don't, I know a lot of people, it can be really hard to convince folks to, spray the repellent on your shoes or on your socks, tuck your pants into your socks. It looks kind of nerdy, but if it means you can still enjoy a steak in the future, I think people might be more inclined to give it a shot. And then the black-legged tick down there on the bottom right, that's the one that used to be called the deer tick. That one you can see is on that sort of eastern third of South Dakota, is estimated to be part of its range. We don't have a lot of woods you got to be sort of that east of I-29 to really be seeing a lot of like forest. So you're not going to pick it up sort of walking around out in the prairie, but it is in South Dakota, and that is the one that vectors Lyme's disease. And you can see if you're pretty much anywhere east of South Dakota, odds are good that you will run into it, especially if you're hanging out in the forest. So that's the update on the tick ranges. But as things have warmed up here in Pierre, I've been noticing more insects that are becoming active, and especially things that have overwintered as an adult. So if you think back to the fall, some of the critters that might have been trying to come into your house, some of the various lady beetle species, some of the flies, those are the things that are sort of first out of the gate in the spring when it warms up. And you can see, I believe this is one of our 7-spotted lady beetles. It is not actually the Harmonia axyritis, the multicolored Asian lady beetle that kind of swarms in houses. But this is a different lady beetle species, but overwinters as an adult, and as things warmed up, I noticed it was active on the weeds out here in front of my office. So things are starting to wake up. So you are going to see more critters, in your lawn, in your garden, around your house if you haven't already. And then I found my first June beetle, kind of by accident. I was doing some yard work over the weekend and had to move a brick that one of my downspouts was resting on, and there was this June beetle that was just hanging out in the soil underneath that brick, and I think it had not been expecting to wake up quite so early, but I did totally dig it out of the dirt and take pictures of it, so you can see it was not super thrilled with me. But these June beetles, the June bugs, they will be sort of starting to emerge from the soil like later this month, especially in the southern part of the state. So keep an eye out for those. They tend to just sort of be a nuisance. They'll, fly into your head, and they're not very graceful. But it was right at the soil surface, ready to go. And then as far as Some of our charismatic mini fauna are insects that are, you know, the pandas of the arthropod world. Monarch butterflies are on the move. This map is from Journey North. So if you are somebody who, you know, likes to observe monarchs, you can actually go to the website and you can input your own data. So whenever you first see a monarch, you can, you know, input some data for South Dakota and help them to track the spring movement. So you can see that the darker red colors are sort of the dates closest to now. And they're starting to, you know, head farther north. It's sort of like going a little bit into, I think our latest week is going to be this April 26th to May 9th. And so you can see that they're down in Nebraska, into Iowa, possibly even heading up as far north as Minneapolis. So the monarch butterflies are coming. I have been sort of anxiously scouting my yard to see when the milkweed that I have is going to pop out. And hopefully we've had about 2 inches of rain over the past couple of days here in Pierre. So that will hopefully, plus the warmer temperatures, will get some of that milkweed emerging so that by the time the monarchs show up, they will have something to lay their eggs on for the caterpillars to eat. So if you do want to have monarchs in your yard and monarch caterpillars, you definitely need to make sure that you've got some milkweed going on. So it's not too late to get some transplants and get those going. And then my last slide is a little bit of a mini rant. I have noticed sort of this campaign for No Mow May going around on social media, and it means well, but it isn't quite fully formed. Pictured on the left here is my lawn after I mowed. So the idea with No Mow May is that, you know, you're leaving the dandelions and other flowering plants like the violets for those early pollinators, the bumblebee queens, the honeybees, you know, all that fun stuff. You can still manage your grass and leave those flowers. You don't have to, you know, end up needing a machete to get through your lawn in June. I just set my mower deck really high. And it kind of neatens up the grass, makes sure my, you know, neighbors, nobody's going to call me, call the city on my boulevard. But the dandelions, for the most part, survived unscathed, as did the violets. So while I understand the thought and desire behind No Mow May, if you truly let your turf go for the entire month, it would be getting really unruly, and I don't know that you'd get a mower through it in June when the campaign ends. So go ahead, mow your lawn, set your mower deck high. The flowers will still be there underneath. And I'm sure there's probably some people like cringing at the amount of weeds that are in my turf, but my long game here is for it to no longer be turf. So in that sense, it's a success. So those are my slides. And I will take a look and see what we've got. Question. Do you feel the population of pollinators are being affected by light? Yes. I mean, the short answer to that is yes. And I will say that habitat is really the biggest one. You know, lawns are a monoculture, you know, lawns can be a monoculture, just like, you know, some ag fields can be, you know, kind of a desert for bees. So habitat is really, really the big thing. The more flowering plants, especially flowering perennials that are endemic to this area that we can reintroduce back into the landscape, the better things will be for our native pollinators. Also, you know, controversial opinion, honeybees aren't going to go extinct. Those are a managed bit of livestock, and we are helping them. So I'm not nearly as worried about, you know, honeybees out and about as I am about the native bee species that are not managed by people and are harder to track because they're perhaps solitary and also have shorter windows of activity. So that's my like entomology hot take for the week. People are welcome to write me angry letters and fight me in the comment section.
Amanda, I actually have a question. So rough numbers, how many different native bees do we have in South Dakota?
Oh man. I know it's at least 100 species.
That's awesome.
It's like I've totally been asked this question before, and I should have it more committed to memory. I do remember, however, that there are 5,000 species of aphids in North America. Thank you, dissertation work. But I have not yet committed like the number of bees in South Dakota.
Well, that's still great to know. And again, we'd be looking for them like not only just nesting the way we expect in hives, but like in the ground and other locations, right?
Yeah, and really, like, you know, instead of like no Mow May, I want people to be like no-till gardening. Because, you know, tilling up the soil every year, especially the things that are ground nesters, you know, tilling that up will disturb, you know, those nests and stuff. So I've got a question in the comments about late enough to clean. So it depends on how thorough you want to be about cleaning. Like, you know, prune off the dead stuff, throw it in the compost pile, go for it. But if your definition of cleaning up includes tilling, I would really encourage you to make this the year that you stop tilling your garden. Because there's really no good time to till your garden that's not going to disrupt the soil structure and the things that are, you know, still in the soil waiting to emerge. Like that June bug was super early, like close to the surface, but because it was under a brick, so it had this really like interesting little microclimate. But I imagine, you know, in other areas of my garden and yard, the insects are still a little bit farther down in the soil profile.
And Amanda, you mentioned something very casually about, you know, if you're trimming those, you know, perennial stems or leaves, all that dried dead material, you mentioned, you know, put it in the compost pile versus put it in the trash, because there's still opportunities if there'd be something in the stems that could still emerge from the compost pile, right?
Yep, totally. Yeah, because I've got like the big, I've got sunflower stems, I've got milkweed stems, and I just essentially break them off where they break and just huck them in a pile, and yeah, stuff will emerge out of there. So, you know, don't go, you know, completely, you know, scorched earth and just like burn everything. Give stuff a chance to emerge. Because yeah, even, you know, though I've been seeing insect activity, I've been seeing syrphid flies, I really haven't seen sort of a ton of the bumblebees and honeybees, even on my dandelions yet. So it has, you know, we talked about last week how it was sort of, you know, cooler there for a while. And I think, you know, things as we've got these 75-degree days, especially here in Pierre and Sunshine, are going to start moving fast. But there are still things that are definitely still waking up from the winter.
All right, I'm going to move us along and we'll come back to the rest of the questions as we have time.
There's a wasp question, so hopefully we get back to
it. Well, you can answer it actually while I'm pulling up my...
While you're sharing screen, okay. Yeah, what about wasps? I don't like them. So I love wasps. Total wasp evangelist here, but this is the time of year that the wasps that overwintered, those were the queens, and so they are going out and about, and they are going to be starting their new nests. So if you see a wasp and she is building a nest somewhere that you don't like it, now is the time to start removing those, because if you let it go until September and you call me about the wasps, I'm just going to tell you to let them go. So this is one to keep an eye out for them, but do understand that wasps care more about finding pollen, nectar, and prey than they generally care about people. However, you know, if they are, you know, in your mailbox, I'm sure your letter carrier would appreciate you handling those little proto nests sooner rather than later. So, all right, I'm going to stop talking about bugs now and turn it over to Rhoda.
All right. Thank you. Just quickly, I wanted to point out some resources that SDSU has for you if you kind of wondering what's happening around the state. And one of them is this cool little thing that you can look up the soil temperature at 4 inches deep. You can do it under bare soil or under sod. There are different stations. So the bare soil actually has more. So 4-inch soil depth. So that's actually a little deeper than your plants or seeds are going to start out at, but it gives you a pretty good idea. And right now we can see the effect of that snowstorm from a weekend or two ago. Temperatures in the 50s across the Northwest and into the 60s, almost 70 in the Southeast. And so once your temperatures reach 45 degrees, pretty much any cool season crop can be planted, things like peas, spinach, carrots, the cole crops, broccoli, cauliflower, and so forth. At 60 degrees, we can start to plant corn, beans, and cucumbers. So in the southeast part of the state, you can look at your forecast, and if it looks like it's going to stay relatively warm, say at least in the 40s and above, closer to 50s at night, go for it with your corn and beans and cucumbers. But hold off on squash, pumpkins, tomatoes, peppers, and melons until nighttime temperatures are pretty much staying above 50 degrees. And they really like to have their roots a little warmer, 65 or more. You know, if you feel the soil and it feels warm to touch, that's a good time for these warmer season crops. One thing I didn't point out is if you go to this website, you can actually go back to past years. You have fewer stations the further back you go, but you can see, well, what was it like last year at this time, and look it up. So that's kind of fun if you're kind of like the historical knowledge. So another thing I wanted to point out was on our extension website, if you click on the garden and yard and then vegetables and scroll down, you'll come to this How to Grow It series. And we have 12 of those up now. We're adding to them all the time. And it'll give you more detailed information about what temperatures each crop likes and when it should be planted, how long it's going to take before it's ready to harvest, how to fertilize, all those sorts of information. So that's available on that website. We also have some more comprehensive handouts on some of the crops, but this is a sort of quick and easy, let's check it out type of thing. And then I wanted to talk about strawberries, and because now is the time when people are going to their nurseries and looking and picking out varieties, and one of the first decisions you need to make when you are buying strawberries is, do you want a June bearing, or do you want ones that are all season bearing? And that's kind of a misnomer because they stop bearing during the very hottest part of the summer, but they'll bloom and bear earlier in the season, and then again as it cools off more towards the fall. This is a June bearing strawberry that was bred by the University of Minnesota, and I can't tell you right offhand which one that is because I forgot to write it down. But strawberries can be grown in rows. This obviously is a very long row test plot, but in your garden, it's best to keep them to like 2 foot wide maximum. Otherwise, it's harder to pick. They get more disease. So every year you come through and make sure you take out the new runners. This would be a Juneberry here. Take out the runners as they start to spread during August. And with June bearing, you'll fertilize them once they stop bearing, right after they stop bearing, because that's when they start to form those new plants for next year, and that's what you want to feed. With the ever bearing, we give them a little bit of fertilizer all season long because they're putting out fruit pretty much all season long. There are some other ways to grow strawberries, and some of you, and we do have a fact sheet on strawberries that you can download, which will give you much more information. Other ways to grow them, and a lot of people do this, is put them in raised beds. You probably don't want them in raised beds that are all the way off the ground because those get too cold during the winter. But when it's raised like this, that's fine. You probably still would want to mulch it with straw during the winter, but you can see these are starting to send out runners. And then, oops, going the wrong way. Ooh, twitchy finger here. Another interesting way to grow strawberries is in gutters, sort of. This was a handmade, homemade type of contraption that could actually be pulled into a shed or something during the winter, or just used during the summer. And so we have gutters here and a substrate and then tiny little strawberry plants that are planted in those. You can do that with the ever-bearing plants because you can fruit those the same year that you plant them. You wait until they have 5 or 6 leaves, about the size of this plant here, and then you can start leaving the blossoms and let them go ahead and fruit. With your ever-bearing, the year you plant them, you want to remove all those blossoms so they put all their effort into making fruit for next year. So, but the ever-bearing, you can fruit that first year and you could have this whole rack just filled up with strawberries that are easier to pick as well. And you can see they actually have gotten a way to water the strawberries and then it drains out. And then I'll go back to questions again. There was one question about a number of years ago, my husband planted autumn bliss raspberry plants in our backyard in Huron. His sister would like to know if autumn bliss will grow in the soil in the Martin, South Dakota area. And if not, autumn bliss, which variety of raspberry would you recommend? If you're looking for fall raspberry, autumn bliss would not be a bad one. Is a little earlier than ones like Heritage, which are so late that you often lose a lot of the fruit to frost. There's another one, Autumn Britain, that doesn't have as much spines as the autumn bliss does and comes in early also. But it is less vigorous, so you'd have to plant them closer together to get the same amount of fruit. If you're looking for summer bearing, of course, you have a whole range of different kinds of raspberries that would work. Boyne or Nova or Latham are all pretty good raspberries. So a number of options there. And will rabbits eat grapevines? They will eat baby grapevines. I know because I had some experimental ones that got chewed off, or at least the foliage chewed off the grapevines, and definitely deer will. So if you're putting out new grapevines, you probably want to put some kind of fence around them, at least or one of those cones that they use for trees to help protect the bottom of the vine. And do we have more questions that I've missed? If not, I would like to thank our presenters tonight, Kristine and Amanda, and our extension behind the persons, Evan, who helps run all this smoothly. And I want to thank all of you for coming tonight and being with us tonight. We hope you will join us next week at this same time, or following weeks every Tuesday night at 7 Central, 6 Mountain. And if you did not get your question answered tonight, and we know we've postponed one of the herbicide questions, you can also contact the SDSU Extension Garden Hotline. You can email them and send a photo, or you can call them, whichever is preferable to you, and they will answer your question, or if they're having having to get more information, they'll get back to you. So with that, good night and have a good week.